Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry about the delay. We had technical difficulties, but we're using such new technology tonight that the wait will be justified. Tonight, thank you for coming. We're going to talk about sustainable buildings tonight. It's one of UKELA's London meetings, which a lot of you are familiar with. UKELA is the United Kingdom Environmental Lawyers Association. We run an annual conference that you're all invited to. That's at the end of June this year. And we run 4 of these London meetings a year. But if you look at our website, there's some pamphlets over there by the door. You'll see what the organisation does. Now, given that energy consumption by buildings accounts for 40% of all energy consumption in the UK, making buildings sustainable is not only necessary to meet our legal targets, say Kyoto Protocol and future targets, if we get there, if we have any, but it's fundamental to our energy culture, to the competitiveness of business, and really to the quality of life that we can expect for the next 50 years. More and more legislation is going to determine how we build, how we design and refurbish our buildings. We may even be asked soon by the Commission to build energy positive buildings, so buildings that create energy, not only consume energy themselves. But is it more sustainable to build new, or is it to refurbish? And how will people like landlords comply with these obligations? Ultimately, do we really understand the effects of our actions and the magnitude of the challenges that we face? To help us answer these questions, we have tonight 3 very distinguished speakers who I shall introduce before their presentations. They will deal with sustainable buildings and climate change from an awareness, from a build and from a legal perspective. So they're all very different talks. First of all, we have Peter Martin to my right, who has an MSc in environmental change, which I'd like to talk to you about that, if you can tell us some more. He's director of the consultancy Carbon Sense, and is today here to demonstrate a tool called the Carbon Quilt that's going to help us visualize a gas that we can't really see, and it's going to help us make that connection between our activities and CO2. Peter has spent the last 15 years engaging people in cultural change, organization development, and sustainable strategies. And I hope your presentation does work. It seems that we've got all the technical difficulties sorted, so if you'd like to step up, please. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Begonia. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try and take you on a little bit of a journey just for about a quarter of an hour or so. Got this rather provocative title, No Place to Hide. You know how it is, sometimes you're asked, what's the title? So this was about a month ago, and it was really thinking about how the world that we live in is changing, and in some senses it's becoming smaller and more connected. Let's see if I can get this to work now. Yes. And how information and communications are becoming in a way all pervasive. And this is going to be true of communications and information that's to do with energy use and to do with carbon emissions as well. Can you see the screen okay? Is that all right with the lights up full? Yeah. Good. One of the things here is that, you know, I was a teenager when people started walking on the moon for the first time, and bringing back these kinds of images. And you know, when we look up at night at the stars or the moon, we tend to think that actually, you know, our atmosphere goes up there. Or, you know, we haven't had much recently, but we have a fine day, we tend to look up into the blue sky and think it goes on for a long, long way. But actually it doesn't. There's a little fine line put round the Earth here to symbolize what is really a very, very thin layer, which is the atmosphere. There isn't very much of it at all. And if we were to take that atmosphere and roll it up into a ball, That's all there is. So it's that we are playing with when we're putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's actually quite small and in some senses maybe quite fragile. How are we doing that? Well, we're doing lots of things, cutting down forests and so on, but the dominant one that everyone's talking about is putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, particularly through burning fossil fuels. 80 million tonnes a day of carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere, which is quite a lot. We can't see it, we can't smell it, we can't taste it. There's carbon dioxide in this room right now. We just can't really tell that it's here. So really what I'm going to be talking about and showing you is some thoughts around how do we depict this invisible gas? How do we start, in a way, to make it visible? What I was going to do is show you a very short video, but actually we've had a little technical hitch, which means that it's going to make sense to hold on to that, and we may look at it in 15 minutes' time or so. So this is going to refer to the UN building, but we're not going to look at that now. I'm going to carry on. So I'm just going to start by looking at some different ways in which these issues are becoming visualized, and you probably know the common ones. We've got regulations in place now that mean that if you're buying or selling a house, you need to have an energy performance certificate, which sets out, in a kind of fairly familiar white goods label sort of way, the performance of the building. The same is true for commercial buildings, buildings for which the public has access. There needs to be a display energy certificate in place, which again is showing you some information about carbon emissions as well as energy. Now, people who like reading graphs, are good at numbers, they're probably happy with those things. They probably make sense. But that's not true everyone. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I now live in Kent, but I used to live in North London, and one of the places I lived was Crouch Hill, which is about 5 miles away from here. I had a look last night on the internet. Haringey Council has conducted an aerial heat loss survey. So you can zoom in, I'm not online here, but you can zoom in on the Haringey website, down to street level and down to individual houses. And what this is, in a sense, a map showing the heat loss from individual dwellings. So you can just pick a house. This is around the corner from where I once lived. The different colours obviously are indicating different levels of heat loss from these buildings. I then went onto Google Maps and went into Street View, and lo and behold, I can see a picture of the house. You can move up and down the street online. So suddenly all this is available to anyone and everyone who wants to have a look. Fascinating. You've probably all seen these thermal imaging. It's being used now to look at issues like fuel poverty, to look at the efficiency of housing stock. It's also being used by companies that are advertising double glazing and so on. And it's being used by campaigners who say, well, the government's introducing all these regulations, but what are they doing themselves? So these are different ways in which these issues are starting to be made visible, and I'm just going to take you through some more. So this is our work of Carbon Sense. We've played around with these numbers and tried putting them in different forms. One of the things we found is this is London's daily emissions. If you imagine that the carbon dioxide at sea level temperature, pressure rather, and at average temperature rolled up into a ball, that's what it'll look like. And these things seem to make more sense. They connect with people more when they're set alongside familiar scenes, familiar landmarks. Bring it down a bit. Well, what's 1 tonne of carbon dioxide? Well, that's how big it would be if you rolled it up into a ball. Or if you sit it outside someone's house, 1 tonne of carbon dioxide. So when people talk about carbon footprints, they talk about the numbers, but often they don't really have any sense of what does that mean, how big is that, or how small is that. This is one of the first images we made when we started on this kind of exploration about 4 or 5 years ago now. This is the granddaughter of one of my colleagues. So, roughly speaking, a metre diameter, that's a kilogram carbon dioxide. Somewhere in my pocket here I've got a little balloon. Sometimes we play around with balloons. You may have seen other people do this. You know, just blow up a balloon when it's about that size, that's 10 grams. It's just a way of bringing these things to life. Right. I'm going to just come out of the presentation for a moment and show you a little film. Which introduces the idea of the carbon quilt. Okay, so yeah, it's in a way it's an artificial idea because, of course, the carbon dioxide is dispersed through the atmosphere and it's moving around all the time. So it's, if you like, an artificial construct, imagining all of that as a layer. But it's just a different way of conveying ideas to help people understand and get a sense of what's going on. So we can, this is a fairly new website, and a lot of this is really still at the prototype stage. I can just take the size of this down. But what we've got here is an opportunity to explore. So I'd like to ask you one or two questions. Anyone here know the size of their carbon footprint or of your organisation's carbon footprint in terms of numbers? Anyone hazard a guess? No one got any idea? No? No one at all? Yeah.
I worked mine out last year.
Yes.
It was about 7 tons.
About 7 tons. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So, one thing I can do here is, I just need to make this a little bit smaller. So this is your 7 tons. I'm going to put in here, and just for added fun, would you like to tell me the beginning of your postcode?
NW1.
So I can put in here NW1. Sorry, I'm not quite used to this pad here. So, if you imagine the whole of the world's emissions, carbon dioxide, in the course of the year, covering the Earth, and then your 7 tons, this is what your 7 tons would look like in proportion to the global emissions, and that's sitting over NW1. Looks like, don't know, is that the corner of Regent's Park? So this is the sort of thing that we can do here. That's your 7 tons shown as a cube sitting next to the UN Secretariat building. And this is your 7 tons shown as a sphere. So this tool is at a very early stage of development, but it's free to access. You can go on here and you can have fun and play around and see if you can find something that is useful. Okay, I'm going to go back to the presentation now. I'm all right for another 5 minutes or so?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, that's the patch, as it were, for Herbert Smith. But I'll steam on. So I'll just quickly show you 3 examples where we've tried using this for different kinds of audiences. First is a local authority that recently went unitary, and that's the typical sort of depiction or presentation of carbon numbers that you tend to see. So we've just played around. That's the patch for central Bedfordshire. In other words, that's the proportion compared to global emissions. But we've tried some other things here. So that's seeing it as a cube. And obviously you can do any kind of breakdown here. And these images have been used at the moment just for internal communication within the council and with their local strategic partnership partners. This is for 1 person in Bedfordshire. And that's a person per 1 person's 1 day. And again, just a fairly elementary breakdown. The council has just set itself some targets for the next 10, 11 years. So again, this is just a different way of presenting targets instead of just seeing numbers, which may help bring it to life. Guardian has recently moved into a new office just around the corner from King's Cross and St Pancras, and they asked if we would do some images for them, again to use primarily internally. So a tonne of carbon dioxide is basically an 8-metre cube, as we saw sitting outside a suburban house. So that's Guardian News and Media's daily emissions presented as a pile of 1-tonne blocks sitting outside St Pancras Station. And that's a different view. Also in North London, Stoke Newington School, usual sort of style of presentation, pie charts. But working with the children, looking at working out what the numbers are and what they look like. This is what we sort of started to find. This is the emissions per person. that's the emissions of the school over the course of the year. The school is just left there of the cube of emissions. And when they were asked, well, you know, how would you like to see this? What would make sense to you? They said, well, what if you spread the year's emissions across Clissold Park next, you know, which is just across the road? What would that look like? So obviously that meant working out the area of the park, and that's the result. And they liked that one. So really just to finish up, the way this seems to be going, I think, is that we can have different sets of questions to what we might have had in the past. Like, how small is yours? And we might even have facilities managers, energy managers, other people making similar sorts of comments. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. I'll take questions at the end rather than after each of the talks, but very interesting to see actually the division between the different types of energy that we use, because that might help people decide where they can cut down, or organizations, where would they prefer to cut down. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Tadj Oreszczyn. I'm told that's how his surname is pronounced, which is as bad as my surname, so I hope he doesn't take offense. He's head of the Bartlett School of Graduate Studies and director of the UCL Energy Institute. He did his PhD in solar energy, which is quite pioneering, I presume, at that time. And he has spent the last 30 years researching and advising energy and buildings. He recently led a government initiative that provided free energy advice to building professionals on 1,200 building projects during the design and refurbishment phase, and managed to identify 15 million of savings in these bills. Today, Professor Oreszczyn will talk us through what is needed from the UK to bring its buildings to the standards required by European legislation.
Thank you very much. I've got far too many slides, so I'm going to go quite quickly into this. I'm going to skip the joke about nuns that I had prepared.
Oh, no.
And just acknowledge, and also very quickly do some acknowledgements in that the work I'm going to be presenting is not the work of myself alone, but a lot of my colleagues. And we also work with many other institutions in collaborative projects, and I'm not going to have time to fully acknowledge everybody as part of that. You've already seen some of these statistics or had them presented to you. There isn't a scenario for any developed country achieving a low carbon economy which I don't think, which doesn't rely on reducing energy demand as much as reducing energy supply, or decarbonising energy supply, I should say. And if you're going to try and reduce energy demand, you have to tackle the built stock. And in the UK, much of the energy use over the next 40 years will be from the existing built stock. We love to keep our houses, and our houses have a replacement life of about 1,000 years at the moment. So many of the houses that we're building now will hopefully be around for quite a long time. If you don't buy into the reason to improve the energy efficiency of buildings purely to try and tackle climate change, there are other good reasons as well, to do with security of energy supply and to do with issues of health, comfort and fuel poverty for doing that. Okay, we're in a very fortunate place in terms of energy efficiency in buildings, is in that we have many, many different options for tackling the problem and trying to reduce energy consumption in buildings. Most of these technologies, in fact, I would say all of these technologies have been around since the 1970s. Insulation, energy efficient windows, heat recovery systems, types of heating systems, heat pumps, solar hot water heating systems, photovoltaic cells and micro combined heat and power systems. They have all been around for 30 years. Over the last 30 years, the technology has significantly developed and will carry on developing over the next 20 years. You could argue that we have the technology We have the technology to build zero-carbon buildings. This is a zero-carbon building in the most extreme environment that you can possibly imagine, although it obviously wasn't zero-carbon to get it up there. So we do have the technology, but the solution is not purely a technological one. We have not only built these in outer space, but we have managed to significantly reduce the energy consumption of our new buildings and our existing buildings. And the building on the right is one of the first generation of zero-carbon buildings that was built by Barratt's and that we've been monitoring. And the house on the left is a Victorian house which we were involved with Camden to refurbish, and it's, in theory, its carbon emissions have been reduced by 80%. Its fuel bills for a 6-bedroom house are about £5 a week. So you could argue that that's it, that's the solution, but we've had demonstration houses like this before. And the picture on the left has the same fabric performance as the picture on the right, which is also a new generation zero-carbon building. Except the picture on the building on the left was built 23 years ago. So it's taken us 23 years to move from an experimental house to yet another experimental house. Now, we haven't got many 23 years left before we hit some very strict deadlines that we've got for 2050. So we've got to up our game a little bit. And really the challenge is not demonstrating this technology as one-off, but actually how do we deploy this to 24 million dwellings within a very complex socio-economic system that actually results not in theoretical energy or carbon reductions by 80%. And there is reasonably good agreement that what we now need to do is embark on what's being called the Great British Refurb, where we will significantly refurbish all of, or most of, the UK housing stock by 2030. In fact, the target is set. We've got to do things to buildings first because the technology is largely here. We've got, we can't build nuclear power stations very quickly. So a lot of effort is being put in at the moment to trying to reduce our carbon emissions. However, we have more evidence than we need that technology alone will not deliver the solution. We have, in fact, in theory, reduced our, improved the efficiency of our buildings by about 30% over the last 30 years. Yet, over the same time, the amount of energy that our housing stock has used has gone up by about 30%. Which is exactly the opposite to what you would have expected. And the reasons for that I want to briefly try and explore using examples from buildings that we have monitored. I do not want you to go away thinking that technology is not important in the solution to this problem. Technology is incredibly important in the solution to the problem, but technology alone will not solve this problem. Now, we all find it very difficult to understand energy use in buildings, and we've had some examples of how we can try and simplify representations. I just want to explain briefly why I think it's quite difficult to understand energy use in buildings, and that in part explains why we have not ended up reducing our energy use in buildings. Energy use in buildings is far more complicated than energy use in cars. In cars, you use energy for one main purpose, to drive you from A to B. You may also occasionally use it to run your air conditioning system in the car, but the majority of the energy goes for one purpose, and it's one type of energy, it's petrol. When you look at a house, you normally have electricity, you also have gas. Some of them can both be used for heating, but they're used for a plethora of reasons, for heating, for cooling sometimes, for running appliances, for heating hot water. That makes it much more difficult to try and interpret what's going on. What's more, fuel bills are actually quite erratic and difficult to interpret. If you went to the petrol station, filled your car up, and you went to pay, and the guy said, "Well, I'm not really sure how much fuel you put in your car today, so I'm just going to charge you 50 quid today, and maybe later on I'll find out exactly how much you have put in your car, and then I'll charge you something different to compensate for it." It would be quite difficult to understand whether your car was performing well or badly if that was happening. But that's exactly what happens with houses at the moment. You have estimated fuel bills, and it's difficult to know what's going on. On top of that, it might be a warm winter like we're having now, or last winter it was cold, and is that the reason that your fuel bills have gone up due to the fact that you've actually changed your occupancy behaviour, or is it just that the climate's changed, or is it just the fact that the fuel prices have risen? And in fact, historically, the fuel prices have been dropping, which is why we've actually paid less attention to this than anything else. If, however, instead of using oil and gas to run our buildings, you had to power them with people, you would actually have to have 8 very fit athletes working 24 hours a day, every day, in order to provide the electricity. If you had to pay these people the minimum wage, then your fuel bill would be £400,000 per annum, and you would certainly notice that. What fossil fuels have done is provide us with tremendous service that before would have involved massive physical activity. And as a result of that, it's become so cheap and so easy that we sort of ignore it and don't pay much attention to it. So we're going to embark on the Great British Refurb, which is going to have a massive challenge, and I would argue one of the greatest engineering challenges that we're going to face this century, to refurbish all of our houses. The red line is the largest energy efficiency refurbishment scheme that we currently run, which is something called Warm Front, which attempts to tackle fuel poverty, where people on low incomes are given free insulation and free heating systems. And we're talking about doing something much more radical, probably spending something like 10 times the amount of money per house, but also tackling 10 times the number of homes. So this is actually quite a different scale that we're going to be operating on. I haven't got any spherical balls, but my balls are a cube. And this cube is actually the amount of insulation that we will have to install in all of our houses in the UK. That's what the Great British Refurb involves. It's 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre. We've got to spread that out over all of the UK houses in order to insulate them. So not a major task on one level. Okay, I just want to look at historically a little bit about how well or badly we have been doing in the past. And this is the only diagram that we know that actually has real energy data from large numbers of houses that tries to relate the age of the house to its gas consumption. And these are predominantly gas-heated houses. And each one of these triangles that you see here is about 1,000 properties. And the horizontal scale is the age at which that house was built. And the vertical scale is, for the same year, the gas consumption for those houses. And the good news is that newer houses use less gas than older houses. So thank goodness we're getting something right. It's slightly worrying, however, the amount of scatter, and some of the triangles suggest that some estates are doing worse than estates that were built in the 1930s. So that's a particular problem. 1973 was when we had the first oil crisis, and this is my passport to being a grumpy old energy man. This was my carbon ration, or should I say my oil ration book, as it was called then, that was issued to me when I wanted to ride my moped up and down the streets. We did actually introduce fuel rationing in the 70s, or we were just on the verge of doing it. We issued all these books. We didn't actually implement it. So always talk about carbon rationing is not new. We've supposedly taken energy efficiency seriously since then, and we've been building, and our regulations for building energy efficient buildings have been increasingly ramped up, and you'd have expected a bit of a kink in the curve around them, heading more in the downward direction, but there isn't any particular signs of that there. And this is the targets that the UK government has now set us for new houses. All new houses by 2016 will be zero carbon, once, of course, we have worked out what the definition of zero is. And it's absolutely fantastic watching politicians trying to redefine the number zero. And this is what we're planning to do for the Great British Refurb. We're trying to reduce the energy for the whole housing stock, probably by around half of the energy consumption. So that's the challenge that the government has set us all to do all of this. And I want to really just demonstrate how big a challenge this is by going back to looking at some data from the Warm Front Scheme, which was this scheme to help tackle fuel poverty that the government has introduced, where the government gives away about £350 million a year of free insulation and heating systems to try and make people warmer in the houses predominantly. Now, we were given the job to monitor 3,000 of these homes before and after the energy efficiency improvements. And what we found from the study was that we got an increase in temperature in living rooms and bedrooms, which was great because that meant that fuel-poor people were less likely to suffer the health consequences of that. Their comfort was improved. Fuel cost was reduced. Mould incidence was reduced. And as a consequence, we've got some interesting data about how this actually improved mental health and could reduce winter deaths, which I won't talk about, but is actually quite an interesting thing about how energy insulation can improve mental health. But what does it do to energy use? Well, the mean energy use actually went up by 30%. And so we've been trying to unpick why that is. And the real reason is summarised by this great quote that in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they're not, and we need to understand why that is. And in this particular case, I would hypothesise that there are three reasons which I'm going to briefly cover. One is that we've applied the physics wrongly. Please take note, I am a physicist, and it's not that physics is wrong. Physics is never wrong. I had to give a presentation at DEC to some economists last week, and they were saying, physics is wrong. And I said, no building that I know breaks the laws of physics, but the way we apply the physics is wrong. The buildings are not often built or refurbished as modelled or as theory would like them to be. And also, we just don't understand very much about how people behave in buildings, and that's actually fundamentally important. So, applying the physics wrongly. When we calculate the potential energy savings, one of the things that this scheme does is it draft strips the houses. So you have people going around sealing up all the cracks. What we found out was that after the Warm Front Scheme, the buildings were no more airtight than they were before. And we did some unpicking, and what we found out was that yes, the buildings were more airtight, where central heating wasn't also installed, which is the second row, the number 22 row. There was a 14% reduction in air infiltration in leakiness when central heating wasn't installed. But if central heating was also installed at the same time as draft stripping, then actually the air infiltration went up. And in retrospect, this is an obvious thing. You've got a group of people going around sealing up the cracks in a building, and you've got another group of people putting in an energy-efficient heating system, drilling holes through the floorboard, drilling holes through the wall, and mounting new boilers. So you've got one group of people sealing up the cracks, another group of people making a whole new group of cracks. Okay? It's easy to sort of laugh at this, but we need to understand these fundamental things if we're going to achieve the targets that people are talking about trying to achieve. Okay, another example of getting the physics wrong, or applying the physics wrong, is a new build scheme here, which a colleague of mine with colleagues at Leeds Metropolitan monitored. These are some new houses which were built to the next set of building regulations. During the construction, they checked that all the insulation went in, they pressure tested the houses to make sure they were airtight. They then measured the heat loss of these houses, and it was twice what they had expected. And twice is quite a big number for something which is relatively simple to look at. And they couldn't understand why. And they did quite a bit of investigative work. And they found out that the reason was that the party walls in the houses, the walls between two adjacent terraces or semi-detached houses, was losing more heat than the exterior wall. And when you model and you get one of those energy certificates when you buy a new house, when they run the models for that, they assume that there is no heat loss through party walls. And that's because you assume that you've got a party wall, both sides are heated to roughly 20 degrees centigrade, and there's no net heat flow. All the heat flow is between the inside and the outside. And that was the case until 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, we decided that we didn't like to hear our neighbours next door. And so we changed the acoustic regulations to make sure that all of our party walls were now built as cavities. And the diagram here you see is the cavity between two adjacent houses. When it was fully built, then the outside would be bricked up. So this is not a complete thing. And what happens is the heat comes in from adjacent houses, it goes into this cavity, it goes up like a chimney, up into the loft space, and the infrared images that you see on the right show the heat coming into the loft space above the insulation. And that means that a party wall loses twice the amount of heat as an exterior wall. It means that a terrace house loses more energy than a detached house, and a semi-detached house loses more energy than a detached house, which is completely counter to what all of the models that have been run on to predict the energy performance of buildings. Now, why has it taken us 20 years to discover something that we knew the physics of cavities and chimneys and that they took heat up? That's all been known for 100 years. But it's taken us 20 years to discover this. It could have cost £5 to fix this problem when you're building the building. To retrofit it will be a lot more expensive. The reason is that we've been living in an emperor's new clothes world where everybody's been happy to do theoretical calculations, but very few people have actually done real measurements in real buildings and find out what's really going on. And that has got to change. If we're going to meet these types of targets that people are talking about for reducing CO2, then we've got to live in the real world and find out what's really going on and put it right. It isn't rocket science that we need to do it, but we do need to pay attention to these details, and we will probably need to legislate and take people to court when they get it wrong in the future. Not refurbished as modelled. This is often where we bash the UK construction industry as being not as good as that in Germany or other places. It is actually quite difficult to do some of the detailing and get the insulation in everywhere that we would ideally like to do. It's difficult in refurbished buildings, it's difficult in new buildings as well, and here you can see the heat escaping above the door and above the windows in a detail. But we're going to have to just pay much more attention to do this and get the methods right as to how to do that. The last thing is changes in occupant behaviour that we don't understand. Often this is talked about as the rebound effect, take back or comfort factor. And in fact, in the warm front scheme, we wanted people to be warmer. So it was appropriate that some of the benefits were taken as improved thermal comfort rather than reducing energy consumption. But people interact in complex ways. In the case of the warm front scheme, yes, we put in the new energy efficient heating system, the radiators, to replace the system on the left, the old inefficient heating system. But many people, we suspect, carried on not using the new system, but the old system. And the warm front scheme doesn't allow the old system to be ripped out. It only allows new systems to be put in. And if people don't use those new systems, then you just don't get the benefit from it. And that's what has happened. Another example of the rebound effect, and an extreme example of the rebound effect, is the beloved domestic conservatory, of which we build many tens of thousands in the UK every year. We got involved in looking at how people use domestic conservatories, and you can save energy with a domestic conservatory. If you have one of these spaces, it traps the sun's heat, some of that heat will permeate into the building, it can reduce your space heating consumption by about 5 to 10% in theory. And the models, lots of models have been run to show this. Europe had a program to try and increase glazed spaces. But when we looked at how people really use them, 9 out of 10 people heat them. And if you heat a glass box, then it loses a lot of energy. And in fact, if you put a glass box on a new building and heat it to the same amount as the house, it will double the energy consumption of that house because it has 10 times the heat loss per unit area that a conventional, well-insulated modern wall does. When we found this out, the people came to us and said, well, what should we do? How should we regulate this? Should we ban conservatories? Oh, you can't ban conservatories. The UK population really loves them. We had a survey of 5,000 conservatory owners which showed that they were the most loved space in UK houses. Okay, they said, well, if you can't ban them, what are we going to do? We're going to make them all double glazed. And we said, yeah, okay, let's have a look at that. We looked at the data, and double glazed conservatories were heated twice as much as single glazed ones. And they use twice as much energy as single glazed ones. Now, the physics would tell you exactly the opposite. Why is that? Well, what's happening is that you can't sit in a single glazed conservatory in the middle of winter and watch TV comfortably. Even if you have the 10 kilowatt heater that will blow your fuses working to heat the air up, the radiant temperature from the glass surface will just make it so uncomfortable. But if you have a double glazed one, hey, you can actually sit in there in the middle of winter and watch TV. But it'll use a lot more energy than if you sat in a normal extension. And so what's happened is that the technology, all the improvements in the technology, have resulted in change in behaviour. So it's changed conservatories from transitional spaces to normal, fully occupied, habitable spaces. And actually, when the regulations have tried to control the energy use, we've subsequently found that they actually have not had any impact, so that actually conservatories are now heated even more than they were before. And actually 10%, up to 10% I think it could be, in London are also air-conditioned now. I'm probably going to skip this slide. There are issues to do with the health impacts of the Great British Refurb, because I've probably taken up far too much time already. And I just want to finish on a couple of slides. One is to really summarise, I believe the Great British Refurb is essential. It's going to be a big change. It's going to be a massive challenge to actually do this. It will not be easy or cheap. People like myself over the last decade have probably oversold how easy and cheap it is to do. It will cost us, but I will still argue that it's cheaper and easier than many other alternatives. And we are going to have to do something to tackle this problem. It really does require us to better understand how people interact with technologies. It will require real verification of things and the impacts that has. And the technology for doing that real verification is coming on stream quite rapidly, and I would predict over the next 5 years you will all be surprised at the sorts of things that people will be offering you to put into your buildings to enable you to verify that they're working correctly. There will be major and rapid changes in research in this. The warm front project, which really discovered that the warm front scheme wasn't quite working as well as it should have done, was a tremendous success from my own personal academic point of view. I got 12 academic publications. I got a publication in The Lancet, the most prestigious journal that I could have ever imagined to publish. But after 7 years, all I'd found out was that the warm front scheme didn't work, and I didn't really know why it didn't work. Well, if we're going to tackle this problem in the next 2 or 3 decades of refurbishing all of our houses, we've got to rapidly change the way that we do research, but also the way we deploy technology and understand how technology is working. We've got to develop an industry that's worth £10 billion per annum. We do not have a refurbishment industry. We don't have something similar to the nuclear industry campaigning for nuclear power stations and saying, it's not going to be as cheap as you think to have nuclear power stations. We need a similar industry to do that for the refurbishment industry. We need to take care in terms of future changes to health and impact of climate change. We don't want to solve one problem of the energy used to heat our buildings only to create another problem of them overheating. And this has obviously all got to go hand in hand with relevant policies, and I would argue that it'll need to go hand in hand with significant rises in fuel prices. If we're to avoid us simply reducing our energy consumption in our houses, but to using the energy in other forms to have great fun and entertainment. And this is just some examples of how we can use tremendous amount of energy to do that. I was going to finish off just to sort of, I felt obliged that I had to do something legal, and to finish off with the fact that in 1974, I think, we introduced legislation which I don't think has been repealed, and I'd love somebody to tell me whether it had or not, which actually prevents us heating our public buildings to temperatures above 19 degrees centigrade. And I don't think anybody has ever been taken to court with that. And we have the building regulations, and this is the energy bit of the building regulations, which are getting much, much tighter and will in 2016 say zero carbon is what you have to achieve. But I am not aware of anybody who has been taken to court for and successfully sued for building an energy inefficient building. And I believe that will have to happen if we are to achieve buildings that really do perform. At the moment, it's so low on everybody's agenda. The building control inspectors don't take it seriously because they've got lots of other things to worry about as well. So I think I had vaguely, and I'd love to have somebody comment on, thought of setting up a charity that did nothing but sued builders and architects and designers for building energy inefficient buildings and try to change the way that we do everything that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure you'll have a lot of takers for that, charities. You're in the right forum for finding lawyers and new areas of expertise, really. Also, I'd like to know if anyone can make transparent bricks, because that would fix the conservatory issue, that we like conservatories, but we don't like bricks. Malcolm is next. He's a solicitor and an environmental lawyer. He's a consultant with Charles Russell, but he is also LexisNexis energy and climate change specialist. He writes and speaks extensively on energy and climate change and advises clients on green leases and energy. So today Malcolm will review green leases with us, I believe, and he also has some practical drafting suggestions for the new carbon reduction commitments in leases.
Okay, good evening. I'm going to change the focus now to commercial buildings away from domestic refurbs, and also to the question of what happens when lawyers get their hands on this sort of issue. So I'm going to be speaking about green leases very broadly, and also about the impending carbon reduction commitment, CRC energy efficiency scheme, that is bearing down on us with implementation expected in April of next year. And in your packs, what you have is a set of the slides. You have some drafting, which is a rider that's taken from a recent transaction. And having looked through quite a number of files over the last couple of months, this seems to be pretty typical of the drafting that is circulating. To the extent that it's a suggestion on drafting, you'll see it's not necessarily my suggestion of how it ought to be done, but what is actually happening. And the third element is an article that turned out to be something of a tirade in the New Law Journal on the way that the property sector is addressing energy efficiency and climate change in general. So, with that warning that this could easily turn into a bit of a tirade, I'll launch into it. So, green leases have been very nearly flavour of the month for about the last 3 or 4 years. The public profile of climate change has been rising fairly inexorably. I would put one of the real milestones in the climate change debate as being the change of editor at The Economist in the early part, about March of 2006. If you read The Economist's coverage of climate change issues up until then, the editorial line was very much, climate change is too uncertain to be the basis for any business decisions. So we'll wait and see. We'll see how the science pans out. Change of editorship, when John Micklethwaite became editor of The Economist, all of a sudden the editorial line was, well, everything we talk about is uncertain. That's what risk is. So clearly climate change can and ought to be factored into business decisions. The tone shifted. Then, of course, we had an increasing body of literature coming out from the Intergovernmental Panel, the Fourth Assessment Report, that factored in adaptation in the strongest terms yet. There was the Stern Committee report, and lawyers began to sit up and take notice. And what happened at that point? So we're still 2006, 2007. People started to look around for models of, we have an issue, we're lawyers, of course we're going to be able to draft for it. Where can we nick a precedent from? And Australia was the place that seemed to be in the lead. So green leases, or green lease schedules, were developed in Australia essentially as a public sector mechanism. Green lease schedules were imposed as a compulsory and mandatory adjunct to both new and existing leases in the public sector, setting out a range of clauses that are intended to regulate behaviour. So we're moving away from the fabric of the building towards the use of the building. And that's really where leases come into their own. Unlike many other types of contract, a lease isn't a one-hit, one deal on your way. A lease is a relationship between the parties who are interested in that building. The landlord, the occupier, the lenders, and any of the other participants in that sector. The green lease model extended on a voluntary basis into the private sector in Australia and was picked up by a number of working parties. There was a London climate change seminar at Oxford Brookes, again back end of 2006, bit of a work stream through 2007. And green leases became one of the things that leading players in the sector wanted to use. Land Securities began to draft and impose green lease schedules on their tenants. Hermes did the same. Prudential looked into it. And as soon as you get players of that magnitude looking at green leases, they become factors in the market. The issue, though, is that people weren't really clear about what green leases were for, when they could be imposed, whether this was something that could just be introduced as part of new lettings, or whether there was any mechanism, any imperative for landlords to revisit existing leases and to try to impose behavioural obligations on tenants with leases that may have 5, 10, 15 years left to run. That fed into the Better Buildings Partnership Green Lease Toolkit that was published earlier this year in April. And given the link to it there on the slide, worth having a look at, because the toolkit stems from a lot of work that was done by law firms, and boroughs did quite a bit of work on it. I think BLP were involved. British Land, having made a fairly massive commitment to this area, fed in its perception of what green leases were, why they should be used, and why they were the next big thing. So we're moving towards a situation where landlords, leading players in the market, are trying to push into existing leases as well as new leases clauses that are derived from the Australian model. And the sort of issues that we're looking at with green lease schedules are clauses that seek to incentivise or penalise behaviour. Clauses that either set a movable rent by reference to energy performance, or that look to reward or slap the tenant when it comes to rent review. We're looking at service charge provisions that enable landlords to recover the costs of introducing, replacing, or maintaining energy and water efficient kit. Now, that is a response to the fundamental landlord and tenant issue. Generally, tenants do not pay for improvements. Green lease clauses are battling against that absolutely embedded principle that if anything is going to stand as an improvement rather than simply a repair or a maintenance, that really ought not to hit the pockets of the tenant. As well as that embedded, woodfall dominating principle, we're also looking at a trend in court decisions over the last decade or so, where the courts are looking at commercial leases increasingly as contracts to occupy. The principle that the courts have tended to apply in cases like Jardine and Scottish Mutual, Flo Daniels and Shortlands, that whole line of cases, is firstly that if something isn't clearly an obligation of the landlord, of the tenant, rather, if it is not clearly the tenant's obligation, it's going to be the landlord's obligation. And if you're looking at the allocation of risk and cost in a building, the courts have tended towards the view that anything that is of a substantive capital nature really ought not to fall on the tenant unless there is a blaringly obvious clause to say it has to. We're looking at provisions that try to regulate the tenant's fit-out of the building, the works that the tenant carries out when it goes into a building that has been designed and constructed to have a great asset rating, and green lease clauses aim to ensure that the tenants don't go in and decide they're going to have a fit-out that involves taking out all of the windows so they can have banners hanging out of there, wrecking the energy efficiency of the building. And then finally, there's this broad notion of some kind of financial reward for the tenant for behaving well, for complying with its energy standards that are imposed by the lease. Now, what we're looking at, therefore, is a situation where clauses that have come through from the green lease schedules are trying to change behaviour, they're trying to use financial mechanisms, but they are consistently running up against the fundamental structure of the institutional lease in this jurisdiction. The other type of document that's brought in, you see reference to MOUs, memoranda of understanding, and these are being proffered by people like Hermes as add-ons to existing leases, an alternative to deeds of variation. And they broadly seek to do the same things as the green lease clauses themselves. Why is this happening? Well, over the last 5 or 6 years, there have been a number of potential drivers for change, behavioural change between landlords and tenants. Landlords, for a while, were very big on corporate social responsibility. CSR, again, was the next flavour of the month. That momentum seeped away somewhat when Companies Act 2006 reached its final form. If you remember, had something like 600 amendments in the last week of that Act's trudge through Parliament. And despite huge lobbying, the area that people like CORE, the Corporate Responsibility Coalition, were pinning all their hopes on, codification of directors' duties, achieved precisely 0. It was a codification that said, we're putting this into statutory form, but actually you have to read the statutory form in the light of all existing case law and duties. So honestly, nothing has changed, was the message from the government. So CSR is still being embraced by a number of organisations, but it didn't acquire teeth as the driver for introducing green lease clauses or their like. Energy performance of buildings, the building labelling regulations. As far as private sector buildings were concerned, they really, in behavioural terms, amounted to not a huge amount. A couple of reasons for that. Firstly, private sector buildings are assessed simply on asset rating, on how efficient they could be. So you can have a building that has, a very good asset rating, and then you wander in and the tenant merrily leaves the air conditioning on 24 hours a day all year. And so what? Absolutely nothing flows from it. So the crucial importance of CRC is that for the first time, really, we have something that is going to hit somebody in the pocket. And because there is a price tag attached, first of all, to initial acquisition of allowances, and as the scheme gets into full swing, there is a benefit to be obtained from recycling payments. There is a penalty to be suffered from losing those repayments, from figuring in a very low position on the league tables that the scheme administrator will apparently concoct. Somebody has to pay. And that is when we hit the fundamental flawed assumption of CRC and existing landlord and tenant relations. Because the one question that the commercial property sector is focusing on is simply who is going to pay, who is going to pick up the bill for CRC. Subsidiary question, which is actually a different question, the way that drafting is running, is who gets recycling payments, who is entitled to repayments, to rebates from the scheme administrator. Once those rebates have been returned by the scheme administrator, how should they be applied? What should happen with that money? What we then come up against is this broader debate. The current institutional lease in this jurisdiction, is it in any way fit for purpose when we look at CRC, when we look at the allocation of costs, risks and benefits for improving the energy efficiency of a building, but also for improving and regulating the behaviour of the occupiers of that building. Now, the fundamental assumption that we still have is that the point of a lease is, from a landlord's perspective, to get as close as you can to being a clear lease. A situation where the rent you receive from the tenant represents pure profit. The landlord doesn't have to dip into its pocket to fund repairs. It doesn't have to dip into its pocket to fund capital expenditure during the lifetime of that lease. And that's a real problem, because the way that commercial property is valued is still fundamentally a function of the rent, the income stream. And value gets hit very hard as soon as the landlord has to dip into its own pocket. And there are people like the RSCS Valuation Forum, Philip Parnell of Drivers Jonas, who are working hard to try and shift the basis of valuation, so that the tyranny of year's purchase, of yields, is broken and a more flexible approach to valuation is brought in, but it's a massive uphill struggle. Institutional lease assumptions still hold very, very strong.
Malcolm, sorry to interrupt. You asked for a 5-minute warning.
That's fine. So, what we've seen is an accelerating trend towards people putting into leases green clauses. But if you look at the sort of clauses that are in circulation, all they are actually doing, from a landlord's perspective, is saying that the cost of CRC should, in a great ideal world, go to the tenant. The tenant's response is generally the classic drafting response of amending the thing you see in front of you. And so a basic landlord's clause would essentially say the tenant is obliged to pick up the cost of allowances and to behave himself so that we get our recycling payments back. Tenants' amendments focus on the narrow grounds. Well, hang on a second. If we're going to have to pick up the costs, we're in a multi-let building. We want to be sure that those costs are allocated between all of the tenants on a fair and reasonable basis. And so property lawyers get to grips with how you're going to say a fair and reasonable basis in legally sensible terms. So there is drafting going around that tries to pin that down further to an allocation of CRC costs by floor area. That rapidly becomes an absurdity because you then have to look, for example, across a portfolio at different uses of floor space. Are you looking at a portfolio where one tenant is incredibly energy intensive, a bakery, a commercial high energy user, or a retailer who, of course, leave their lights on all night for their displays as opposed to an office? So floor area basis, not a terribly sensible way of going about it. Tenants are then trying to draft out fair and reasonable so that there's a requirement to take into account those different types of energy use. Tenants are also then moving on to say, well, if we are being asked to pay top-up, pay extra costs for allowances, we need to know why. I, as a tenant, have behaved myself. If you, landlord, are now asking me to pay more, or if you're telling me that I will get less back through recycling payments, I would actually rather like to know who is responsible out of all of your tenants for that situation. So tenants' clauses are seeking the sort of information that is terribly interesting, but frankly, from a landlord's perspective, either an extreme pain or virtually impossible to provide. There's a tenants' amendment that seeks to exclude liability for any additional costs that are triggered by the landlord's own commercial decisions. A landlord might find itself running out of allowances because in the middle of a scheme year, it's decided to buy a new shopping centre. Perfectly reasonable question from a tenant's perspective. Your decision, why should I pay anything extra? Then we get to what I think is the real crunch. Tenants are saying, if you, landlord, are requiring me to pick up the initial cost of allowances, there is no way I'm letting you keep the recycling payments when they come in. I absolutely require those payments to come to me. Policy terms, that is catastrophic, because if there is a policy agenda behind these recycling payments, it's to reward good behaviour, to provide a pot of money, to invest in improved kit, in more efficient plant and equipment. And as soon as that money goes back to the tenant, clearly they will be under no obligation to spend it on any such thing. They might as well drink it. So, having looked at those amendments, my question is whether tenants are actually starting off with the right question, whether it is a sane response to tinker with landlords' drafting, or whether what's required is actually a far more thoroughgoing objection to the principle of costs being passed on to tenants in that frankly crude way, because it simply does not serve the policy objective of the CRC. It doesn't tend to improve energy efficiency of buildings, and it actually ends up with some very ugly drafting. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Right, so food for thought there. Very interesting that tenants want the recycling payments back. I hadn't thought of that, but...
well, wouldn't you if you'd been asked to pay it?
Yes, it makes sense. Can I take questions now? I'll be quite brief because we started late, and I'm hoping that our speakers will stay for a drink and we can talk over a glass of wine, perhaps. But any questions from the audience, gentlemen?
Well, firstly, thank you for this really very interesting stuff. I think my question comes from Malcolm. The CRC, you said implementation is likely to be next April. We're going to have a general election sometime around then. Do you see that getting in the way of this legislative programme? Probably applies to the recast of the Energy Performance and Buildings Directive as well, which is staying through.
I actually don't see any hold up to the scheme if there even is a change of government and there's sufficient cross-party commitment to it. And crucially, underpinning that, there's a whole bunch of civil servants who've spent too much time getting an ear bashing from property lawyers amongst others. The British Property Federation have weighed in to make their points. I would assume it's happening. The registration's already essentially underway. The process is rolling out.
Just the pink shirts, please.
Why can't you make a tenant pay for the energy that they use when it's always smart meters on the property, and then maybe setting up an energy investment fund so that those tenants, all the tenants, can then dip in and out if they want to improve the property to make it more energy efficient?
That's more or less the point I was driving at. That I think what I've seen, my kind of remit tonight was to essentially report on the drafting that's knocking around, and most of the drafting that I've seen doesn't get to that level of sophistication. I would strongly argue that it needs to. There's a cost, for example, about £300 per smart meter, which is a Prudential estimate. And if you multiply that over the Prudential portfolio, then you're talking about a lot of money. And so you have kind of inertial factors like that. But yeah, I think the whole thing needs to be thought afresh. Institutional assumptions just don't seem to me to work in this context.
Next question, gentlemen.
Question for Tadj. You didn't refer to the RHI or FITs in your talk here about the British refurb.
Yeah.
And obviously those got an important role to play. Could you just give your view quickly on whether they help the process? And the secondary question really, which is, do you think the RHI should come in first? Because it seems to me that a lot of the heat, or something incentivising improvements in heat, might be a faster gain, a quicker gain, than trying to get the electricity improvements.
So you'll have to explain to me what the RHI is.
The renewable heat incentive.
Right, okay. You're going to have to decarbonise the supply at the same time as improve the efficiency of buildings. You can't do one without the other. Well, there's all sorts of problems going on at the moment. I think, I mean, it was interesting in your opening remarks about making buildings positive, not just zero. We actually object to even going to zero for buildings. It's completely inappropriate to try and make all buildings zero carbon, for instance, because it is, you know, if you made all new buildings zero carbon and you spent that money by making them stand alone zero carbon, you know, by actually generating all of the energy that they need from renewables, you could invest that same amount of money to make almost a sort of, I forgot the figure now, it's something like a 70% reduction in the whole housing stock for the same amount of money as getting all of the new buildings completely zero carbon. So, you know, it's, you have to decide how you're going to spend your money, and to spend your money on individual buildings and invest in renewables, if that's what you're applying. You're better off investing the money in centralised renewables than you are in actually having them distributed around buildings. Of which, and the extreme farce of that is wind turbines that we went through on buildings. It's just crazy to install wind turbines on individual buildings rather than to build them centrally. It just don't make any sense. But there are some real issues between the supply and the demand that we're really going to have to tackle in the future, which is actually quite, which I don't think people have fully got to grips with. So at the moment, we advise people to only heat their houses, for instance, when they need heating. And that's the sensible thing to do. In the future, we will probably be advising everybody to heat their houses 24 hours a day, which sounds quite counterintuitive to try to reduce carbon emissions. But if you go for the targets that the government has set for reducing the decarbonising the supply, then the lowest carbon form of heating will be electric heating for houses, and we will probably, in many of our houses, we will get rid of gas, not only for security of energy supply, because we won't want to depend on imported gas, but also because it is the lowest. It'll be the lowest carbon form of heating our buildings. And then if we all turned on our electric heat pumps at 6 o'clock in the morning, like we do at the moment for our gas central heating system, then the whole system would collapse. And the reason for that is that the only reason the whole system doesn't collapse with gas is that there is so much stored gas in the pipework of our gas supply systems that when we all flick on the switch, it copes. Well, it doesn't happen the same with electricity. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, and I've gone off some completely different track, but it's actually quite a difficult thing to tackle this whole issue of renewables and the heating system.
Colleen?
Has there been any indication from government level or EU level that there will be money put towards a refurb program? Because that's what you're suggesting, and it seems, particularly in the kind of economy we're in at the moment, that putting money into builders getting going to refurb things quite sensible.
I can't see the whole refurb. I mean, the whole Great British refurb happening without. Well, somebody's going to pay for it. I mean, ultimately, it'll always be us. Unfortunately, I don't know of anybody else who pays for anything other than us. Ultimately, the question is how that's arrived at and how it's distributed in a way which enables everybody to do it. And there are already schemes for like CESP where the government is putting pressure on utilities to invest, like the Warm Front schemes, to invest in refurbishing buildings, and that scheme is starting to be rolled out next year, where I think they're doing 40,000 houses, and in effect subsidising those people on low incomes. Those people on higher incomes will ultimately pay directly, and the question is at what point you make them pay, whether it's actually at the sale of their house or buying the house. I mean, in the end, we're probably talking about what many people spend on refurbishing their kitchen. That's the sort of amount of money we're talking about now. So we may have to try and persuade people that they're going to have to live with their kitchen slightly longer and instead invest some of the money in refurbishment measures. But yes, it's going to be a tough one, and it's a tough one politically.
Do you know what percentage of houses, I mean, anyone might know this, what percentage of houses owned by social landlords? The local authorities moved from the private sector, but there's still the contractual arrangement. Does anyone know? Because that would also come into realm financial.
Yeah, I mean, and I should know the figure off the top of my head, but I don't, but it is a significant proportion, and there's been more effort gone into social housing and improving the energy efficiency of social housing than there has, bizarrely, in privately owned houses. There have been many schemes, and there are many refurbishment schemes. I mean, I think the annoying thing is that things like the Decent Homes refurbishment programme that has been going on to bring homes up to a fit standard, has not at the same time taken the opportunity to increase the energy efficiency to a significant level. I mean, it's improved and made sure that people can achieve a comfortable standard in these houses when they've been refurbished. And they've been multi-million pound refurbishment, but they put in the minimum amount of energy efficiency measures. Had at the same time they introduced significant energy efficiency measures. And it's always cheaper to do these things when you're refurbishing anyway, and that's, you know, what we'll have to do is over the next 20 years is realise those opportunities, you know, at the right time to install these measures. So, you know, if you're replacing the windows, it's far cheaper to replace them with more energy efficient ones when you're doing it, and to do it well, rather than refurbish and replace them because they're just worn out and then have to replace them again for energy efficiency reasons. It's crazy.
I'll take one more question, and then I'm sorry. Perhaps the lady at the back, perhaps over a drink, because it's a little bit late.
Just a quick question that kind of popped up from the panel. Just thinking, the first presentation was very much focused on how you demonstrate someone's carbon emissions in order to get them to change their behaviour. The second presentation, they were talking about the fact that behaviour hadn't been studied well enough in order to actually come up with the right solution at the right time. And with the third presentation, talking about the framework of legislation we're going to use to force people to change their behaviour. And I was just wondering, had any modelling research or thought been given to actually whether that behavioural change will create the impact that we're trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, I can. The theoretical modelling of everybody reducing their thermostats by 1 degree in housing, for instance, results in roughly a 10% reduction in energy consumption. Where it gets tricky is that the government thought that the way to do that was to give people better controls, and so you get an energy benefit, you get a better rating for your house if you have controls. It appears that giving people better controls at the moment doesn't seem to actually make them control the house any better. And that's partly because the controls are a bit dumb, and partly because there isn't really the incentive for us to reduce energy, I would argue, at the moment. There is really just not the incentive, and we have a debate where I work about what we can define as wasted energy. And I would argue that leaving the lights on is not a waste of energy. Energy buys us useful services. And if you leave the lights on, the useful service it buys you is you don't have to get off your butt and turn them off and turn them back on again. Right, so we're getting very little service, useful service out of that, but we are getting some. So we don't completely waste energy, we always do something with it. But some things we just get minimal benefits, and you know, the slightest financial thing would actually make people change. But at the moment, energy is just so cheap. It really is so cheap, and it will have to rise. I would estimate that by 2050, fuel prices in real terms will go up fivefold, and that will start to change people's behaviour. That will have to be combined with better regulations, and it will have to be combined with you know, mass improvements of the efficiency of, you know, all technologies. But people just paying attention to it. We haven't really paid much attention to all these things.
So in theory, the CRC requirements for people to spend money, will there be big financial consequences if you don't? Is the way forward?
Well, it seems to be the impulse at the moment, but I know DEFRA is carrying out its second very large study on environmental behaviour, and looking specifically at, for example, energy use and behaviour which affects environmental matters, because they don't think they've got it right so far. So watch this space. It's interesting that before legislation is passed, there's always a risk assessment that looks at the cost of implementing legislation, and certainly we have not put behaviour as one of the factors to look at, and maybe that should be a proposal in the future for environmental legislation, really. Right, I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you very much for coming. Please join me in a warm thank you to Peter Martin, Tadj Oreszczyn and Malcolm Dowden.